The air in Versailles was rancid, soaked in the odor of perfume and decay. Inside a gilded chamber, King Louis XV lay rotting, his face sagged pustules blooming like curses. Courtiers looked on in frozen horror, not with grief, but relief. The beloved king was dying and France was watching. He couldn't run. Smallpox held him prisoner inside his own body. Blackened skin, fevered breath, a crown too heavy even for his pride. He had dazzled France once, now he terrified it. The court gathered eyes wide, not in reverence but in dread. Death had entered Versailles and he wore red velvet. How did this happen? A king once adored now sparked murmurs of joy and death. To understand, one must trace his journey from golden promise to grotesque finale. Versailles was his creation, his prison, and now his tomb. The mirrors that once flattered now reflected ruin. This wasn't death, it was justice. May 1774. Versailles shimmered with deception. Marble halls glowed like liquid gold, yet everything rotted underneath. The Hall of Mirrors captured secrets, not splendor. Once Louis XV ruled like a god. Now he merely haunted the palace. He built a stage of masks where charm replaced truth and rot replaced glory. He was never meant for this fate. Born in 1710, orphaned young, crowned too soon. A child adored by France. Louis the Beloved, they called him. He was beautiful, graceful, their golden hope. But hope is fragile. Over time, the boy king faded and the nation's love turned to ashes. In youth, he was elegant and sharp dark eyes behind powdered wigs. Voice soft but commanding. Versailles adored him. He moved like shadow through silk and scandal. But behind crystal chandeliers and orchestrated bows, something sinister festered: detachment. His sin was not tyranny, but indifference, and that would doom a nation. Louis loved pleasure more than power. Hunts at dawn, gambling at dusk, and women whose laughter echoed down empty halls. Ruling bored him. Ministers and mistresses governed while France bled. His heart had drifted long before his body decayed, and the people, starving, began to see him for what he was. The 1760s brought reckoning. The 7 Years' War drained France dry land, gold, pride, all gone. Peasants rioted while Versailles dined. Mistresses like Madame de Pompadour and Madame du Barry reigned with jewels and whispers. The people didn't hate them. They hated the king who let them rule while bread vanished. He had been a master of ceremony, but now his stage betrayed him. His absence became his legacy. A king ruled by others' hands, blind to his people's pain. In Versailles, the whispers grew louder. The beloved had become the burden. France no longer watched in awe, but in calculation. Even his smile, once a spell, became a curse. Behind it lay silence. He ruled with charm, not justice. Promises could not fill bellies. Flattery could not rebuild an empire. By the time pustules marked his skin, the people had already buried their loyalty. What died wasn't just a king, but faith. He married Marie Leszczyńska, a pious queen who bore him 10 children. But she never held his heart. Versailles saw her as a relic of formality. Louis turned instead to mistresses, first Pompadour, then du Barry. These women wielded real power. The queen remained in the background, her silence louder than prayer. Madame de Pompadour wasn't just a mistress. She was strategy, influence, and elegance woven into one. She guided France's culture-censored opposition and whispered policy into the king's ear. Versailles bowed to her. But the people saw decadence, lace, and jewels while they starved. She was brilliance, but also the spark of resentment. When Pompadour passed, du Barry rose. Cruder, bolder, more hated. The courtiers mocked her. The people despised her. She flaunted her power like perfume. To many, she embodied the rot of Versailles, a mistress who ruled while peasants begged. Louis loved her laughter, but her laughter echoed louder than their cries. By the late 1760s, Louis was a shadow. His eyes dulled, his decisions hollow. Versailles gleamed, but the kingdom crumbled. Ministers stole. Nobles schemed. The Enlightenment stirred outside the gates, voices rising. Voltaire, Rousseau, calling for reason, liberty, change. Louis remained unmoved. In his silence, revolution didn't just grow, it sharpened. The palace still glittered, but the air was stale. Courtiers bowed, smiled, and whispered betrayal behind lace fans. The king no longer inspired awe, only calculation. He became a symbol of absence. Versailles, once alive with power, became a mausoleum of rituals. Its heart, like its monarch, beat without meaning. While Louis hosted balls, the countryside burned. Taxes rose. Bread vanished. Crops failed. Parents buried hungry children. The nobles escaped into tapestries and gardens. The people could not. They cursed the king, then cursed God. In the echoes of starvation, France began to whisper of justice not divine but man-made. France hadn't forgotten love, but it had learned betrayal. The beloved king became a cautionary tale. The more he withdrew, the louder the people grew. He wasn't a tyrant. He didn't need to be. His indifference did the work. A king absent in spirit had already abdicated his soul. Outside the palace, ink replaced swords. Pamphlets spread, ideas sharpened, reason over right, justice over lineage. They questioned kings, gods, and even Versailles. Louis, cocooned in candlelight, didn't read. Or if he did, he dismissed them. But France was listening, and France, once silent, was starting to answer back. In 1770, the tremors began. Riots in the provinces. Nobles arrested. One dared criticize the crown, he vanished. The court trembled not for him, but for themselves. Louis stayed behind closed doors. He saw the fire but turned away. By then it wasn't his court that ruled, it was fear. He began to withdraw. Not just from decisions, but from people. Curtains drawn, audiences canceled. Courtiers waited hours for a word. Some left, some plotted. Versailles, once a furnace of favor, turned cold. The king was alive, but the monarchy had already begun to rot from inside the crown outward. The Hall of Mirrors no longer flattered. It reflected weariness. Every bow felt forced, every laugh too sharp. The king's beauty had faded. His voice lost weight. Even the marble seemed tired. Versailles wasn't a palace anymore. It was a stage where the final act dragged on and everyone sensed the curtain. Daily ceremonies continued, but meaning had drained away. The king dressed, blessed, nodded, all choreographed echoes of power. Ministers bowed without loyalty. Nobles smiled without trust. The rituals remained, but reverence was gone. It was like praying to a corpse habit without faith. And Louis the idol was beginning to decay. Mistresses still laughed behind silk fans, but it was sharper now, tinged with fear. They knew the court's favor was fleeting. One scandal, one wrong glance, and they could fall. Versailles devoured its own. Louis watched weary, detached. The drama bored him. But France outside wasn't bored. It was boiling. Philosophers sharpened their pens. Bakers sharpened knives. The aristocracy danced blind to the heat rising beneath them. Even the servants whispered of revolution. Versailles pretended not to hear. Louis reclined, sighed, and shuffled ministers. But the fire was coming. Not from within, but from below, and it would not be ignored. The palace looked glorious on the surface. Gilded ceilings, marble floors, velvet drapes. But beneath the surface, mold, decay, cracks in statues, worms in wood. The rot of a kingdom reflected in its king. The illusion held, but just barely. Versailles was a wound wrapped in gold, and it had begun to bleed. Then came the heat, not from politics, but from the body. Smallpox. It began as a flush, a shiver. The king coughed. A rash bloomed. Courtiers pretended not to see, but fear spread. Doctors were summoned. Quarantine whispered. It was no longer metaphorical decay. The king was truly rotting alive in gold. He lay beneath embroidered sheets. The pustules wept, his breath stuttered. The disease spared no dignity. It blistered the hands that once held scepters. It scarred the lips that kissed empires. Around him, nobles stood in silence, more afraid of infection than grief. Louis XV was dying, but none wished to touch him. The crown sat untouched. No physician could stop it. No prayer could reverse it. The king's flesh blistered, blackened, peeled. Yet the courtiers watched, morbid, fascinated, not with sympathy but anticipation. His end meant their beginning. And so France's king died, not alone but surrounded by masks, not mourning, waiting. At the end, his voice returned barely. He called for a confessor. Whispers say he muttered, "I have failed my people." Perhaps regret, perhaps ritual. His words faded like breath on glass, but they lingered in the chamber. Not loud, not brave, just a final murmur spoken too late to matter. One last bath, warm water against rotting skin. He whispered to his wife, "Live." It wasn't grand, it wasn't royal, it was human. The king no longer majestic, no longer powerful, just a man facing the mirror. No crown, no ceremony, just warm water and the slow drowning of a legacy. He was not yet dead, but already paraded. Courtiers came and went, peeking at the withering figure beneath heavy tapestries. They murmured condolences while calculating futures. The room stank of rot and ambition. Death was no longer feared, it was expected, and the king's body had become Versailles' final entertainment. On May 10, 1774, before dawn, silence fell. No fanfare, no trumpets, just breath gone. Louis XV, the beloved, turned bird and closed his eyes. Candles flickered low. Courtiers bowed, not in reverence, but routine. The reign had ended not with thunder, but with the soft rustle of silks leaving the chamber. No one wept. No cries echoed through the halls. The king had died, but mourning did not follow. Instead, eyes turned toward the future, toward the new king. Versailles held its breath, not in sorrow, but anticipation. The dead king left no grief behind, only power to be divided. In Paris, the news arrived like wind. The king was dead, but instead of mourning, there were toasts, quiet ones, in dark corners. The people didn't celebrate the man, they celebrated his absence. Louis XV had not been hated. He had been endured, and now at last he was gone. Louis XVI ascended the throne, a boy with heavy eyes and heavier expectations. The crown passed smoothly but not lightly. He inherited a court of parasites, a kingdom of anger, and a palace of illusions. His youth gave hope, but hope in France had often been the seat of ruin. Versailles remained gilded, polished, echoing with false laughter, but its foundations trembled. The people wanted bread, not beauty. The philosophers wanted truth, not titles. The crown no longer sat on marble, it sat on sand. And every step the new king took shook it closer to collapse. Louis XV had left a trap. Dubarry vanished, exiled, forgotten. Pompadour's paintings gathered dust. Their reigns ended with his breath. No letters, no statues, just jewels locked in drawers and memories no one dared mention. Versailles moved on quickly. Mistresses were useful only when the king was breathing. Once gone, they became ghosts in perfume. The ministers, once smug with power, now scrambled. New alliances, new lies. The death of a king was not just an ending, it was a reshuffling. Secrets were buried, ledgers burned. Each man tried to erase his sins with new loyalty oaths. Versailles had no time for grief, only reinvention. France wasn't mourning. France was starving. Fields failed. Markets collapsed. Debt choked every town. And still the palace glowed. Gold ceilings, crystal chandeliers. Outside, a woman buried her child in winter soil. Inside, another banquet began. The contrast wasn't just cruel, it was kindling. Revolution stirred in every cold breath. Louis XV left no legacy of law or victory, only echoes. Whispers of wasted beauty. Warnings carved in neglect. Historians would write of his grace, his charm, his ruin. His reign became a parable. What happens when a king forgets his people? Not a tragedy, a lesson, burned into France's bones. Versailles stood still, no reforms, no repentance. The new king hesitated. The old court whispered. The people waited, but not forever. The silence was not peace, it was pressure. Beneath the silence, discontent boiled. Louis XV had died in bed. Louis XVI would not be offered the same mercy. The Hall of Mirrors remained unchanged. Tourists of power still strolled, gazed, admired. But the mirrors remembered. They had seen love turn to disdain, majesty to rot. They reflected not just faces, but failures. And every reflection now asked the same question: who would be next to fall beneath the glass? Louis XV's charm once bent courtiers, soothed mobs. A glance, a grin, it had been enough. But charm couldn't fill stomachs. It couldn't repair war. It couldn't survive rot. In the end, his smile died first. The crown followed. And France learned beauty without duty is just a mask waiting to slip. From Brittany to Burgundy, hunger ruled. Mothers boiled grass. Fathers vanished for bread. Children learned silence. And in Paris, pamphlets spread like fire. They spoke of rights of rage, of kings who feast while children die. France wasn't reading history, it was preparing to rewrite it with blood and banners. What Voltaire and Rousseau had whispered now roared. Liberty, equality, brotherhood. The words once passed in salons now echoed in prisons, markets, churches. The Enlightenment had found its army. No longer ideas, they became weapons. And Versailles, blind behind its lace curtains, didn't see the match being struck. Louis XV left no monument, only warnings. His reign taught France that apathy is poison, that a king who watches while others suffer will one day suffer alone. He ruled without brutality, but with neglect. And in doing so, he taught the people not to fear the crown, but to question it. When Louis XVI wore the crown, it didn't rest, it crushed. He carried not just France's hopes, but its resentments. Every mistake of his grandfather shadowed him. Every indecision reminded the people of old silence. And though his head remained high, his path was already leading toward a sharper ending. The palace that once symbolized triumph became a mausoleum, not just for Louis XV, but for monarchy itself. The chandeliers flickered, the fountains gurgled, but the air smelled of endings. Versailles didn't need to fall in flames. It was already crumbling from meaning, from memory, from history. A jewel turned to dust. The king no longer dictated the narrative. The people did, with ink, with bread, riots, with songs mocking the crown. The story of Louis XV wasn't told by priests, it was etched in revolution. And the chapter they wrote next would not be about kings, it would be about justice. Louis XV died with a whisper, a groan, a sigh. But what followed was not silence, it was echo. The echo became murmur, the murmur became chant, and then roar. In the end, his death was not an end. It was a beginning, a prelude to the storm that would shake the world. Louis XVI ruled from the chair, haunted by echoes. Every decision he made was judged against his grandfather's failures. Every silence, every delay reminded the people of a past that had already betrayed them. The throne wasn't solid, it trembled with memory. The monarchy hadn't fallen yet, but it had cracked. Louis XV was gone, but his presence lingered. His portrait still hung, his perfume still clung to tapestries. Courtiers invoked his name with reverence or blame. Ministers quoted him, then did the opposite. Versailles wore him like a ghost, too heavy to forget, too shameful to praise. He ruled still in absence. What Louis XV neglected, his heir inherited: the debt, the hunger, the rage. Each unpaid tax, each untouched reform returned like ghosts to collect. France was no longer patient. The people wanted action, not lineage. And the new king learned quickly, a crown handed down with rot can never shine clean. Versailles tried to dance. Masquerades resumed. Dresses swirled. Toasts were made. But the laughter rang hollow. Everyone felt it, the tension, the eyes outside the gates, the letters smuggled into court. No amount of silk could hide what was coming. The mask of monarchy had begun to slip, and underneath was fear. In the provinces, hunger marched before armies. Bread wasn't just food, it was fire. Crowds gathered not for sermons, but for screams. They no longer believed in kings. They believed in their empty stomachs. Louis XV had taught them that royalty forgets. Now they would make themselves unforgettable with stones and slogans. Louis XVI was not heartless, but he was hesitant. He saw the fire but feared the spark. He listened but too late. His heart was burdened with duty, not clarity. And every moment he paused, the crowd surged forward. His grandfather had done too little. Now doing nothing was deadly. One by one, the symbols shattered. Nobles fled, streets burned, banners rose. The Hall of Mirrors, once a monument to monarchy, reflected revolution instead. It showed a people unmasked, and though the glass remained intact, the illusion it held cracked forever. The king still lived, but the kingdom he ruled had changed. In a shadowed corner of Versailles, nobles clinked glasses, a final toast to a past already fading. Some believed they could ride the storm. Others planned escape. All remembered Louis XV's smile, his silence. And in that memory, they felt a chill, for they knew what followed his indifference fire. The next generation watched. Princes, pages, seamstresses, scribes. They saw the sickness, the whispers, the exile. They learned not loyalty but caution. They memorized how quickly favor faded, how easily kings died in silks. Louis XV didn't just fail his people. He taught the future how not to rule. It started as smoke, a rumor, a riot. Then it reached the gates of Versailles, not with cannons, but with purpose. The people no longer feared the crown. They had faced hunger, plague, war, and now they faced their king. Louis XV was dead, but the reckoning he birthed had finally arrived. The gates of Versailles groaned, guards braced, hooves thundered beyond the forest. But it wasn't an army, it was a people, farmers, mothers, merchants, their voices louder than drums, their demands clearer than decrees. Louis XV had ruled by silence. His grandson now faced a reckoning shaped by noise. In salons and galleries, portraits of kings gathered dust. The smile of Louis XV no longer comforted, it provoked. Artists stopped painting royalty. Poets stopped praising. The memory of the beloved had curdled. Where once they saw a symbol, now they saw a warning. Beauty without justice is rot in disguise. The nobility, once invincible behind etiquette, found themselves exposed. Streets knew their names. Doors slammed on their silks. Some shaved their heads. Others fled in disguise. The age of favors was ending, and those who once bowed before Louis XV now bowed before survival. The revolution was choosing new gods. The crown had passed to Louis XVI, but it cast Louis XV's shadow. Every delay, every failure was tied to the sins of the past. His grandfather's decadence echoed in every bread riot. Versailles wasn't haunted by ghosts, it was haunted by memory, and memory now demanded justice. They remembered the jewels, the mistresses, the gold gates. They remembered the carriages rolling past starving fields. Louis XV's name became a curse on peasant lips, muttered while burying children. He didn't just leave behind a crown, he left behind a grudge, one that sharpened into blades. Madame du Barry was dragged into the light. No longer a lady, just a name tied to excess. Crowds screamed her name with venom. Her jewels were seized, her past dissected. Versailles had turned on her. What once charmed, now condemned. And the people began putting pleasure itself on trial. The rituals ceased. No more dressing ceremonies, no more court dances. Versailles fell quiet, not in reverence, but in fear. The illusion of monarchy had shattered. Louis XV had staged a kingdom of performance. The audience, once obedient, now tore down the curtains. The show was over. The theater was burning. What had once been unthinkable now became inevitable, questioning the right to rule. Debates that began in books spilled into streets. Louis XV had ruled with detachment. Now detachment was a crime. The people no longer asked what the king would do. They asked why kings existed at all. No grand tomb, no golden procession. Louis XV was buried quickly, quietly, far from public eye. His death had not inspired mourning, it had stirred rage. No monument marked his greatness, only the revolution. His tombstone was carved by fire, his eulogy written in revolt. History offered no flowers, only judgment. His body had decayed in life. His legacy did the same in death. France did not remember him with love, but with shudders. He was not cursed, he was forgotten, then remembered only when the people needed a reason to rise. And Louis XV gave them one through every scar he left behind. Louis XV's greatest sin wasn't cruelty, it was silence. He watched a nation bleed and did not speak. He watched hunger rise and did not act. His indifference buried more than policies, it buried trust. And when France finally found its voice, it did not whisper. It roared loud enough to break thrones. The new queen stood in halls once ruled by mistresses. She saw the stares, felt the judgment. Every jewel she wore was a reminder of du Barry. Every gown a whisper of Pompadour's reign. She inherited not power, but resentment. Louis XV had passed down a kingdom already poisoned by luxury. The royal guards, once loyal to a fault, wavered. Some defected, some disappeared. Versailles was no longer sacred, it was a target. Banners replaced tapestries. Gunpowder replaced flattery. The old king's security had rested on awe. The new king's walls trembled beneath a people who no longer believed in myths. The crown still glittered, but it no longer commanded reverence. It sat on a head bowed more in worry than in majesty. Louis XVI wore it heavily. The people saw not gold, but guilt. They remembered who built the palaces, who ignored their cries, and the crown once holy now felt stolen. Graffiti replaced sermons, no bread, no king, down with Versailles. Slogans bled across walls like war paint. The people no longer looked up to royalty, they looked past it. Louis XV's image, once revered, became a caricature. His powdered face mocked in taverns. His memory spat like bitter wine. Versailles became a trap. The gates that once kept peasants out now kept royalty in. Inside, paranoia bloomed. Outside, revolution marched. Louis XV had built a palace to contain power. Instead, he created a cage of mirrors, and now every reflection showed the bars more clearly than the beauty. The words once censored returned as verdicts. Rousseau's cries, Voltaire's wit, Diderot's fire. Their philosophies had been mocked by Louis XV's court, now they judged it. The Enlightenment didn't need guillotines. It had already disarmed the monarchy with reason. By the time heads rolled, the ideas had already won. No portraits of Du Barry hung in the new courts. No statues of Pompadour stood in the public square. Their names, once powerful, were now dangerous. They vanished from history books, reduced to footnotes of shame. Versailles had devoured them. France erased them, their only legacy being symbols of too much. The Bastille fell, not for Louis XVI alone, but for everything that came before. For the rot of Louis XV, for the hunger, the silence, the perfume over blood. It wasn't just a prison that collapsed, it was a legacy. The people weren't storming walls, they were storming centuries. Louis XV lingered not in body but in consequence. His choices echoed through each guillotine. His neglect carved the path. He had died quietly, but his silence now screamed louder than his speeches. Every revolution has a ghost, and has walked Versailles long after his corpse turned to dust. The robes of royalty, once admired, now symbolized theft. Each thread was weighed against hunger. Each jewel sparked fury. Louis XV had worn them with ease, indifferent to the world beneath. Now those same garments caught fire in satire and revolt in memory. Fashion had become fuel for revolution. When blades fell in Paris, it wasn't just the present being punished, it was the past. Each drop of blood avenged a generation ignored. Louis XV was not on trial, but his legacy was. And with every execution, the echo of his reign was carved deeper into the marble of history. Once velvet-cloaked power, now it was stripped, burned, mocked. Courtiers who wore it now begged in peasant garb. Versailles had taught them luxury, not survival. Louis XV had created a court of aesthetics. The revolution taught reality, and reality didn't wear silk, it wore scars. No more grand entrances, no more fanfares. The monarchy lost its choreography. Without ritual, there was just man and throne, and the man trembled. Louis XV had relied on spectacle. Remove the curtains, and even a king looks ordinary. That ordinariness became dangerous. The divine right dissolved into human fear. They dragged the crown into court, not physically, but symbolically. Debates erupted. Can one man rule millions? Does bloodline equal wisdom? Louis XV had never asked. Now France demanded answers. And each unanswered question chipped away at the throne until it no longer looked like law, but fraud. The palace became a relic before it fell. Tourists whispered through its halls, staring at decadence like ruins of Rome. Louis XV's bedroom, his mirrors, his bath. Not sacred anymore, just evidence. Versailles was no longer home to kings. It was proof of how far royalty had drifted from reality. Justice became the new crown. The people didn't just want bread, they wanted reckoning. Names were remembered not with affection, but with accusation. Louis XV's era was relived through trials, confiscations, guillotines. The monarchy hadn't just failed, it had wounded, and wounds demand healing, even if it means cutting deeper. Marie Antoinette bore the weight of legacy. Each smile reminded France of Pompadour. Each indulgence recalled Du Barry. She paid the price not just for herself, but for all who came before. Louis XV's mistresses haunted her trial more than laws. Her sentence began the day his indifference became tradition. As Louis XVI approached the scaffold, the shadows of the past walked beside him. He wasn't dying alone. Louis XV stood behind him in memory and consequence. The people did not cheer for death. They cheered for closure. And the curtain that fell wasn't for one king, but for an entire age. The ashes of Versailles scattered, some into history, some into revolution. Louis XV left no empire, only echoes. His beauty faded, his charm forgotten. What remained was a lesson that power without purpose becomes poison. And France, born anew in blood and banners, carried that lesson forward, etched in every revolution that followed. Years passed, the revolution rewrote names. New flags flew, new crimes came, but Louis XV, he faded not as a martyr, not as a monster, but as a warning. His name was not cursed nor praised, just remembered briefly, then left behind like perfume on a burned curtain. No statues of him remained in Paris squares. No schools bore his name. He wasn't banned, just forgotten. The revolution didn't need to destroy his image. His legacy had already crumbled. The people no longer needed to tear him down. Time had done that more efficiently than guillotines ever could. A new France rose from fire, skeptical, hungry, defiant. Its children no longer bowed. They asked, questioned, demanded. And in their boldness, Louis XV became a footnote. The king who didn't listen. The monarch who watched history knock and chose not to answer. His silence became the loudest part of his memory. The revolution spared no one. Priests, princes, philosophers, even the revolution devoured its own. Yet in the smoke, a lesson endured: sovereignty must be earned, not inherited. Louis XV never understood this, and so the people took back what was theirs with ink, with blood, and with a roar that never stopped. Versailles stood empty, the fountains dried, the mirrors dulled. Tourists whispered through its halls like mourners in a mausoleum. The ghost of Louis XV didn't walk the halls, it lingered in the architecture. Every column, every chandelier whispered, "This is what forgetting the people looks like." Louis XV left no air of greatness, only consequences. His indifference seeded revolution. His luxury inspired revolt. His shadow fell not on his grandson alone, but on an entire world questioning power. That was his true inheritance, not gold, not glory, but a spark in the dry hay of history. The revolution crowned no king. It crowned the people. Farmers, teachers, soldiers, rulers now. Louis XV's palace had once excluded them. Now their voices ruled the squares where once only silk spoke. The monarchy did not fall. It was replaced by something louder, sharper, and impossible to ignore: the will of the people. Writers picked up where kings failed. They chronicled, dissected, judged. Louis XV's charm didn't survive their pens. They exposed the rot beneath the robes. They turned court gossip into national indictment. His reign wasn't rewritten, it was revealed. And in that revelation, France found not vengeance, but clarity. In the end, Louis XV was never the worst king. He was simply the one who didn't care enough. Not cruel, but careless. Not mad, but motionless. And that made him dangerous. Because rot doesn't announce itself. It spreads quietly under gold until one day everything collapses. And so the silence ended. France spoke with guillotines, with philosophy, with fire. Louis XV had tried to rule without hearing. In return, the people made themselves unforgettable. His reign died not when he did, but when France found its voice. And from that moment on, no king would ever rule unchallenged again.